April 29, 1945. Maeda Escarpment, Okinawa. Late afternoon. A cold rain had been falling on the ridge since morning, turning the coral soil into slick mud. Smoke drifted low across the escarpment, clinging to the broken rock like fog. The battlefield smelled of wet earth, cordite, and blood. American artillery had been pounding the Japanese positions all day, but the ridge still belonged to the defenders. The Maeda Escarpment was a sheer limestone cliff rising nearly 400 feet above the valley floor. It was not wide, no more than a few hundred yards across in places, but it dominated everything around it. Whoever held the ridge controlled the road network leading south toward Shuri, the heart of the Japanese defensive line on Okinawa. Pinned down at the top of the escarpment were the men of the U.S. Army's 77th Infantry Division. They had fought their way up the cliff under heavy fire, only to be met by concealed machine guns, mortar and rifle pits dug deep into the rock. Casualties mounted by the hour. When Japanese counterattacks surged forward at dusk, the American line began to break. Orders came down the ridge. Withdraw. Men scrambled back toward the edge of the cliff, dragging wounded comrades through mud and shell holes. Some slipped. Some were hit again before they reached safety. Shouts and screams cut through the noise of artillery and small arms fire. Darkness was coming fast. One man did not retreat. He was 26 years old. He wore no weapon. He carried only medical supplies and a rope. His name was Desmond Doss. Doss had arrived on Okinawa weeks earlier, already known throughout the division for reasons that had nothing to do with combat skill. He was a combat medic assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment. From the day he reported for duty, he had been different. He refused to carry a rifle, not because he was afraid, and not because he opposed the war. Doss believed the war was necessary. He believed in defending his country. But as a Seventh-day Adventist, he believed just as firmly that he could not take a human life. He would not touch a weapon, even in self-defense. In training, this made him an outcast. Other soldiers mocked him openly. They called him a coward, a shirker, a liability. Some believed he would get them killed. Officers questioned whether he belonged in uniform at all. At one point during stateside training, Doss faced court-martial proceedings for refusing to carry a rifle. The charges were eventually dropped, but the resentment remained. In the barracks, boots were thrown at him while he prayed. Men cursed him for delaying drills. More than once, he was told bluntly that if the unit went into combat, they would leave him behind. Doss said little in response. He trained harder than most. He memorized medical procedures. He practiced under fire during exercises. He learned to move fast, low, and without hesitation. He carried extra bandages, extra morphine, extra plasma. He believed that if he could not take a life, he could at least save one. By the time the 77th Division landed on Okinawa in April 1945, Doss had already proven himself under fire on Guam and Leyte. He had treated wounded men while shells burst nearby. He had run through open ground to reach casualties that others could not. Still, the stigma followed him. The Maeda Escarpment would change that forever. The Japanese 62nd Division had transformed Okinawa's southern ridges into a fortress. Instead of defending the beaches, they fought from caves, reverse slopes, and interconnected tunnel systems. The Maeda Escarpment was a natural strong point steep, exposed approaches with overlapping fields of fire. On April 29th, Company B reached the top of the ridge after climbing cargo nets under enemy fire. Almost immediately, they were pinned down. Japanese machine guns raked the plateau. Mortar rounds burst with deadly accuracy. Every attempt to move forward drew fire from hidden positions. By late afternoon, casualties were everywhere. Medics were stretched thin. Men lay wounded in shell craters and shallow depressions, some screaming, some silent. As dusk approached, Japanese troops launched a counterattack, emerging from caves and concealed trenches. The American line collapsed into confusion. The withdrawal order came to save what remained of the company. As soldiers pulled back toward the cliff edge, Doss stayed behind. He crawled from one wounded man to the next, ignoring the fire sweeping the ridge. Each time he reached someone still alive, he worked quickly bandage, morphine, reassurance. Then came the problem no one else wanted to face. The wounded could not climb down the escarpment. Doss dragged them instead. One by one he pulled wounded soldiers across the rocky ground to the cliff edge. He tied them into a rope sling. With hands raw and muscles burning, he lowered each man down the sheer face of the escarpment, nearly 400 feet into the darkness below where other soldiers waited to receive them. After lowering one man, Doss did not stop. He went back. Enemy fire intensified as night fell. Japanese soldiers moved through the shadows, throwing grenades and firing blindly toward American positions. At any moment, Doss could have been shot, stabbed, or blown apart. He continued. Later, survivors would recall hearing him pray quietly after each rescue. "Lord, help me get one more." Over and over, he returned to the battlefield. Each trip across the ridge was a gamble. Each wounded man weighed over 150 pounds, not counting gear. The rope cut into his hands. Shrapnel tore at the ground around him. At one point, a grenade exploded so close that it blew Doss off his feet. He got up and kept moving. By midnight, Japanese resistance slackened. The counterattack faded. The ridge fell silent except for the rain and the distant rumble of artillery. When Doss finally climbed down himself, exhausted and bleeding from shrapnel wounds, the men below stared at him in disbelief. No one knew exactly how many he had saved. Estimates varied. Some said 50, some said 100. The official count settled at 75. 75 men who would have died on that ridge were alive because one unarmed medic refused to leave them behind. Word spread quickly through the battalion. The same men who had mocked Doss in training now avoided his eyes. Some apologized outright. Others simply shook his hand in silence. Officers who once doubted him now wrote formal commendations. But the fighting was not over. Just days later, during another assault, Doss was wounded by a grenade while treating a casualty. He wrapped his own injuries and continued working until a sniper shot him in the arm, shattering the bone. As he waited for evacuation, he saw another wounded man nearby and crawled to treat him first. When stretcher-bearers finally reached Doss, he insisted they carry the other man ahead of him. Desmond Doss was evacuated from Okinawa shortly after. He would never return to combat. In October 1945, President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. Doss was the first conscientious objector to receive the award. The evacuation boat carried Desmond Doss north, away from the smoke and thunder of southern Okinawa. His left arm was immobilized, The bones shattered badly enough that doctors initially feared amputation. Infection was a constant risk. Morphine dulled the pain, but it did not erase the memory of the ridge, the voices, the weight of each man on the rope, the feeling that time itself had slowed under fire. For the men of the 77th Infantry Division, the fight continued without him. Okinawa would rage for another 2 months. More than 12,000 Americans would die before the island was secured. The Maeda Escarpment would change hands again and again, but within Company B, the story of that night spread rapidly, retold with a mixture of disbelief and quiet reverence. In foxholes and aid stations, men spoke of the medic who would not carry a rifle, and how he had stayed when everyone else fell back. The laughter never returned. To understand why Doss's actions stunned hardened combat veterans, it is necessary to understand where he came from. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia. He grew up during the Great Depression, in a small house where money was scarce and discipline was strict. His father, William Doss, was a carpenter and a veteran of World War I who struggled with alcoholism and lingering trauma from the trenches of France. His mother, Bertha, was deeply religious and raised her children according to the teachings of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. One incident from Doss's childhood stayed with him for the rest of his life. As a young boy, he saw a poster depicting the 10 Commandments. One image illustrating "Thou shalt not kill" struck him with particular force. Around the same time, he witnessed a violent argument between his parents that nearly ended in tragedy. The combination left a deep impression. Doss later said that from that moment on, he resolved never to take a human life. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Doss did not hesitate to enlist. He believed strongly that Hitler and militarism had to be stopped. But he also believed that his conscience could not be compromised. From the beginning, his position placed him at odds with military culture. At Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where he underwent basic training, refusal to carry a weapon was seen as defiance. Fellow soldiers interpreted it as weakness. Some officers viewed it as insubordination. Doss endured harassment, threats, and repeated attempts to force him out of the Army, yet the regulations allowed for conscientious objectors to serve in non-combatant roles. Doss requested assignment as a medic. It did not shield him from abuse. During night exercises, boots struck him while he knelt in prayer. Rifles were thrust into his hands against his will. Once an officer threatened him with a general court-martial for refusing a direct order to pick up a gun. Only the intervention of higher command and the eventual recognition that Doss was otherwise an exemplary soldier prevented his discharge or imprisonment. What set him apart was not stubbornness alone. He never retaliated. He never raised his voice. He volunteered for the hardest duties. He ran extra miles. He studied field medicine obsessively. When others complained, he worked. Slowly, grudging respect began to replace hostility. Combat accelerated that transformation. On Guam in 1944, Doss exposed himself repeatedly to enemy fire to treat wounded men. During one engagement, he crawled across open ground to reach a casualty, while machine gun bullets tore up the earth around him. He stayed with the wounded through the night, improvising bandages and shielding them with his own body until evacuation arrived. On Leyte later that year, he was wounded by shrapnel but refused evacuation, continuing to treat others until ordered away. Still, nothing prepared his unit for what happened on Okinawa. The Maeda Escarpment was not just another firefight. It was a moment of collapse. When trained soldiers broke under pressure, one man without a weapon imposed order through sheer determination. Military historians would later note that Doss's actions were tactically significant. By saving dozens of wounded soldiers, he preserved combat power at a critical moment. The men he rescued returned to duty. The unit stabilized. The ridge was eventually secured. But for the men who survived that night, the significance was simpler. He had not abandoned them. In the months after the war, Doss returned home to Virginia permanently disabled. His arm never fully recovered. Tuberculosis contracted later damaged his lungs. He lived much of his life in quiet obscurity, working modest jobs, rarely speaking about the war unless asked directly. When President Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor on October 12, 1945, the president reportedly told him, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Doss accepted the medal with humility. He did not see himself as a hero. "I just did my duty," he said. The legacy of Desmond Doss is often misunderstood. He was not a pacifist in the modern sense. He did not oppose the war. He did not protest military service. He believed in discipline, sacrifice, and obedience to lawful authority. What he refused to do was cross a line he believed he could never return from. On the Maeda Escarpment, under fire, in darkness and rain, that line held. 75 men lived because it did. Today the escarpment still stands on Okinawa, weathered and quiet. The caves are empty, the shell craters soft by time, but the ground remembers. So do the men who came back. For decades after the war, the story of the Maeda Escarpment circulated quietly among veterans, preserved more in memory than in textbooks. Many of the men Doss rescued carried his name with them for the rest of their lives, spoken rarely but never forgotten. Some would later write letters to him. Others sought him out in person, traveling long distances simply to shake his hand. Their words were consistent. They remembered the sound of his voice in the dark. They remembered being dragged when they could no longer move. They remembered the rope tightening under their arms as they disappeared over the edge of the cliff, believing it was the last thing they would ever feel. In after-action reports, Doss's actions were described with restrained military language, extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, above and beyond the call of duty. But those phrases could not capture what it meant to stand unarmed on a collapsing line, surrounded by enemy fire, and refuse to abandon the wounded. Military doctrine does not account for that kind of resolve. In the years following World War II, the U.S. Army quietly studied cases like Doss's. His service challenged long-held assumptions about combat effectiveness, cohesion, and courage. The prevailing belief before the war was simple. A soldier unwilling to kill could not be trusted in battle. Okinawa disproved that belief. Historians later noted that Doss embodied a paradox the Army had not anticipated, that moral conviction, when absolute, could reinforce rather than weaken combat performance. He did not hesitate. He did not calculate risk the way others did. His boundaries were fixed, and within them he operated with total commitment. On the Maeda Escarpment, that commitment saved lives at a moment when discipline alone was failing. Desmond Doss lived long enough to see the world change around him. He saw new wars fought. He saw conscientious objection become a subject of national debate during Vietnam. He saw his story rediscovered by younger generations seeking examples of integrity under pressure. Yet he never sought recognition. When asked late in life how he endured the mockery and isolation during training, he gave a simple answer. "I knew who I was," he said, "and I knew what I believed." He died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. He was buried quietly with military honors. The outcome of the Maeda Escarpment is now fixed in history. 75 men survived who otherwise would not have. A regiment preserved its fighting strength. A battlefield known for collapse became a place of rescue. But the legacy goes further. Desmond Doss stands as proof that courage in war does not always come from the barrel of a rifle. Sometimes it comes from refusing to abandon others when fear and exhaustion make retreat the only reasonable option. On Okinawa, under fire, one man chose to stay. Desmond Thomas Doss served honorably without ever carrying a weapon. His actions on the Maeda Escarpment remain one of the most extraordinary acts of battlefield, medical heroism in modern military history. He proved that conscience and courage are not opposites, and that saving life even in the darkest conditions of war can alter the fate of many. May those who fell on Okinawa be remembered, and may those who returned never be forgotten.